I've been around the block with true crime. I mean, my law practice has been the last 20 years, primarily representing Chicago police officers, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So I have seen both sides of it. And when I listened to that first episode, Scott Kupch gives you that business card. Could you have ever imagined that you'd be sitting here today where you are at?
No, that's a really great question. And I just, like I do get people who talk to me about stories. You know what it's like. It's like cases. There's so many of them out there, and you just you get an email or somebody talks to you, and it's overwhelming. You don't really know where to go. You sort of feel like you need to look into it because somebody, approached you. But this was unique because it was a judge. And I remember I went to dinner that night with a bunch of public defenders. And I said, guys, let me ask you something. This judge just gave me this card, and this is what it said. And they passed it around the table, and they were kind of looking at it like, a judge said this? Like, they're not supposed to do this. And it got to one of the public defenders from Polk County where this case took place, but it was 30 something years ago. And I remember he said, I know this case. You should call him. And that tipped me off that something was wrong. Like, this guy was saying, I know of this case. And and that's how I got into it. I just started talking to him about it.
And, I graduated law school in 1987, and then I moved to Orlando, Florida, right out of law school.
Right there.
And I was living in Orlando, Florida when Leo Schofield was convicted. I've driven through Lakeland, Florida 100 times.
Yeah.
And so when is the first time, you decide to kind of check it out? When do you think, hey, maybe I'll do a podcast about this?
Well, that's a really great question too, because I had originally, my intention after I started looking into the case and Judge Cupp told me to read the transcript, which I did, I definitely saw something there. And I said, maybe this is a situation where I'm kind of in between books that I'm writing. I could maybe go down and spend a few months and just sort of write a long feature story about this case, because I thought it was interesting. And, right away after like visiting Leo in the prison and just hearing him talk, I remember coming out of there, and I had not been a big podcast fan at that point, but I listened to a couple of them. And I remember just coming out of there with Kelsey, and Kelsey was listening to more of them. And, we just sort of said, what about a podcast? Like, Leo's a great storyteller, and the other people we were meeting had really, really compelling stories. And it was so much different than what I'm used to is just writing quotes on paper. I was hearing them and hearing the emotion and the pain and, the distress and the desperation. I was like, this just sounds too good. And so that's where we decided.
An article, I don't care how long the article was, it could have never, ever come close to what you did with a podcast, because you need to hear the voices.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, and it's kind of similar. I had been representing a guy named Chester Weger, convicted in 1960 of this national news story, the Starved Rock murders, served over 60 years in prison. And I decided to finally just do a podcast kind of for a similar reason. It's a way to tell the story, take a deep dive. It's another way to more effectively tell a detailed story. And what I liked about Bone Valley, I'm not a huge fan of these superficial, let's just regurgitate things. Half the time, they don't even know what they're talking about. You really, and I thought you actually were very fair. Like, I would have been much more like, can you believe this? Like you really were, I thought, very measured. I went back and listened to a couple of the episodes for the second and third time. And you said something like, well, I think the case of Jeremy Scott's making a little more sense to me than Leo Schofield's. Like, yeah,